Last week, Officer Cadet Laszlo Kenderesi of the Canadian Armed Forces was charged with mutiny and scandalous conduct unbecoming an officer for a speech that he gave at a freedom rally. I'm going to take a look at that today on Don't Talk TV. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. Again, I've got a really busy week, so I'm trying to do a quick video for you on something that I personally found interesting. It may not be as polished as all my videos, given time constraints, but I think it's something worth discussing. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, given my history as an infantry officer in the Army Reserves back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and my involvement in the Army Cadets program. So this relates to the recent charge of Officer Cadet Laszlo Kenderesi. So just by way of background, I've got a CTV news article here entitled Military Officer Facing Mutiny Charge After Anti-Vaccine Speech in Toronto. So it says the Department of National Defense says a military officer is facing charges after allegedly urging other members of the Canadian Armed Forces not to help with the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Officer Cadet Ladislas Kenderesi has been charged with one count of persuading another person to join in a mutiny and one count of behaving in a scandalous manner unbecoming an officer. These charges follow a speech at an anti-lockdown rally in Toronto in December in which a man appeared in full military uniform and spoke out against what he called killer vaccines. So we'll take a look at the video, we'll take a look at the laws involved, and I'll give you my thoughts on this. BitChute, this one's entitled, Hero Canadian Officer Leslie Kenderesi Calls to Disobey Distribution of COVID-19 Vaccine. It's from some person called 99%, so here we go.
First of all, I'd like to salute all of you. I'm going to speak plain English. You have the balls and the courtesy to come out and tell the government of Canada that freedom and tyranny doesn't rule over Canadians.
So I'm just going to stop here at the beginning, and there's a couple of things that I have to point out here. So let me just get the annotation tool going here. So there's a bunch of issues with this person's uniform. So you see here, he's got a cap badge here. It's the Cadet Instructor Cadre Officer cap badge, but he's got a flag going on behind it here. That is totally not the way the Cadet Instructor Cadre Officer cap badge is supposed to be worn. You don't have any flag behind it. It's just the cap badge. He's also wearing a black beret. Now, apparently, the alleged backstory of this person is that he served with a tank unit at some point. Whether that's the case or not, again, that's not the Cadet Instructor Cadre Officer beret. Cadet Instructor Cadre are not tankers, therefore they don't wear a black beret. So this may seem small to people who are not members of the Canadian Armed Forces, but in my view, I mean, he's putting himself out there as trying to represent the Canadian Armed Forces, and he doesn't even have the right uniform. But it gets worse than this, because you see, next here, you can just see the shoulder bit here. He's got 1982 pattern web gear. Now, I mean, this hasn't been issued equipment for some years. I wore it back in the day when I was in the Canadian Armed Forces, but the day I was in was when we were wearing olive green uniforms. We didn't even have the camouflage uniforms. I'm not sure when they discontinued that web gear, but it's not legitimate kit for him to be wearing. A, because it's out of date, but B, Cadet Instructor Cadre Officers are not entitled to receive load-bearing vests or web gear. So he's trying to make himself look like some kind of tough combat guy that he isn't. Especially when you add in here the upside-down Rambo knife, trying to make himself look like some kind of special forces guy or something. I don't know what he's trying to do. Bottom line is his uniform's a bag of hammers. You can't see it, but here he's got his rank badge. He's got the old style spaghetti stripe for a officer cadet instead of a pip with a thin stripe. I forget exactly what year it was, but it was several years ago that the Canadian Army switched from stripes to pips and crowns. So he doesn't even have the right rank insignia. Again, this might seem like something small, but I think it's very pertinent to the scandalous conduct unbecoming of an officer. And I mean, it's just, there's so many things wrong with his uniform. He's putting himself out there in the public. And the nature of the things that he's got wrong with his uniform seem to be things that are trying to make him look like something he's not. Along the lines of stolen valor things, where individuals pretend that there's some kind of combat veteran. And he's doing it probably, it would seem that he's doing it to try and give himself some sort of credibility, when really a cadet instructor, officer cadet, should have no credibility when talking about vaccines or the military plan to distribute them. I mean, he has nothing to do with any of that. I mean, if he's a medical professional, then I'd be happy to hear from him as a medical professional what his views are on this. But as a cadet instructor, officer cadet, it's meaningless. But he's trying to make himself seem more important and more official. He actually achieves the opposite, but to people that aren't fully aware of the Canadian Armed Forces equipment, he might fool some people, and so that right there, I have no respect. This man's a disgrace in my view. So now let's have a listen to what he has to say, and I'm gonna skip forward actually to the bit that I think they're gonna try to hang the mutiny charge on him for.
I'm asking military right now serving, truck drivers, medical engineers, whatever you are, do not take this unlawful order in distribution of this vaccine.
Or that's what they're basing the mutiny charge on, I assume, where he says, I'm calling on members of the Canadian Forces to disobey this unlawful order of distributing vaccines. Now, I suppose his defense will be, well, I legitimately think that's an unlawful order, and it's not mutiny to ask people to disobey an unlawful order. I think there's a big difference, a huge difference, between merely partaking in distribution of injections that individuals can voluntarily choose to take or not take. It's their decision, it's their body of whether they want to have these substances injected into them. So I don't see how that defense would fly for him. And the bigger problem here is, aside from the disaster and a dog's breakfast that his uniform is, he's in uniform, getting up, giving a public speech, attacking the Canadian government. Now, this is problematic aside from the mutiny allegation, just because in Canada there's a clear separation between military and politics. We don't have people in uniform making political decisions or giving political speeches. So if he has things he wants to say, I think he has the right to do that out of uniform and not in his capacity as an officer of the Canadian Armed Forces, which is how he's trying to present himself here. So let me just skip to the end and have a look at something else here.
Congratulations and salute.
So I'm just stopping it there again. I mean, the man doesn't even know how to give a salute properly. Again, that may seem like a minor thing, but when you're trying to put yourself out there as some sort of military guy and you can't even give a proper salute. But again, we got the stolen valor kind of stuff going on here. We got this helmet attached to his web gear, which again, why would a cadet instructor or cadre officer even have a helmet? They never go anywhere near combat. They're teaching children leadership. And it's a World War II era paratrooper helmet of some sort. I don't even know if that's American or what it is. But then he's got the Hungarian flag on it here. So again, uniform's just a complete disaster. In my view, this man's, the way he conducts himself is a disgrace. He's abusing the Canadian Armed Forces uniform, and he's totally taking away from the validity of his message. So let's take a quick look at the laws that he's charged under. So I've got here the National Defense Act pulled up here. Under disgraceful conduct, you've got Section 92. Every officer who behaves in a scandalous manner unbecoming an officer is guilty of an offence, and on conviction shall suffer dismissal with disgrace from Her Majesty's service, or dismissal from Her Majesty's service. Then we've also got Section 79 here, mutiny, and offences related to mutiny. I believe it's under Section 81 that they got him here. Offenses related to mutiny, Section 81. Every person who A. causes or conspires with any other person to cause a mutiny, B. endeavours to persuade any person to join in a mutiny, C. being present does not use his utmost endeavours to suppress a mutiny, or D. being aware of an actual or intended mutiny, does not without delay inform his superior officer thereof, is guilty of an offence and on conviction is liable to imprisonment for life or to less punishment. And I think they're probably going on sub B here, endeavours to persuade any person to join in a mutiny. Now let's look quickly, what are the definitions under the National Defense Act? So if we go to Section 2, interpretation here, mutiny here means collective insubordination or a combination of two or more persons in the resistance of lawful authority in any of Her Majesty's forces or in any forces cooperating therewith. Now, when we think of mutiny, I mean, that's a pretty heavy charge. Normally you think of a bunch of soldiers violently overthrowing their officers. You think of things like mutiny on the Bounty, where the crew overthrows the captain and takes over command of the ship. But as we've seen, the National Defense Act seems to have a broader definition that would encompass things a lot less serious than that. I've got here an excerpt from the Manual of Military Law in 1929, reprinted for use in the Canadian Army. And paragraph 5 here, under mutiny and insubordination, says, the term mutiny implies collective insubordination or a combination of two or more persons to resist or to induce others to resist lawful military authority. And it says, if a man has not brought himself within the terms of that section, his offence, however much it may tend towards mutiny, must be dealt with as insubordination. Then if we look at the Queen's regulations and orders, we've got 103.14 here, some regulations as regards offences related to mutiny. It restates the case, and it lays out the test here for sub B, endeavoured to persuade another person to join in a mutiny. And then they have specimen charges or sample charges, and I think this is interesting here, where endeavours to persuade another to join a mutiny. So it would be laid in that he, on date, at place of offence, endeavoured to persuade number, rank, and name of an individual to join him in refusing to obey the orders of the commanding officer to report for duty. So that's just an example. Now, in the sample charge, they have to have a specific individual. So it may be that the prosecution may have difficulties with Mr. Kenderesi because it is more of a general telling at large other individuals of the Canadian Armed Forces to refuse any order to assist in distributing vaccines. I think there's also the issue of there being more than one person. It's just him on his own putting himself out there saying these things. So I'm not entirely sure that the mutiny charge will stick. I'm not an expert in military law, so others may correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. It seems a bit overkill to call that speech mutiny. I think the scandalous conduct unbecoming an officer absolutely applies. Now, I'm sure people who are against lockdowns or who are hesitant or skeptical about the vaccines would be in strong disagreement with me on that. I go back to my comments as I was watching the video. I separate this from what his message is. I don't care what his message is. The way he dressed and the fact of, as an officer, or an officer cadet anyway, putting himself up there, trying to pretend he's something that he isn't, trying to pretend he's something more with all the mixed combat type of kit, that's just scandalous. He looks like an idiot. To anyone who's been in the army, He is bringing complete disrepute upon the Canadian Armed Forces at large, and the cadet instructor cadre in particular. Cadet instructor officers are fantastic people, but I think they already have a bit of an issue with not being considered quote-unquote real soldiers, and stuff like this just adds right into that. And again, as I said, I've been in the Canadian Armed Forces, and here, I'll give you a couple pictures just to show I'm not trying to do some stolen valor myself. Here you can see some images of me. Here's my graduating class from 1999, graduating from basically Infantry Officer Course Phase 1. Here's some other pictures of me in my dress uniform, not wearing a dog's breakfast of mixed up kit. I didn't serve overseas. I'm not suggesting that I'm some hardened combat veteran, but I mean, I know the basics of how bad this looks to be dressed like a bag of hammers, like this Mr. Kenderesi was. And also, I mean, let's be honest, like, why is an officer cadet even getting up there? When I was made an officer cadet, I remember my commanding officer telling me, congratulations, you've now been made the rank that's only slightly higher than the slugs that crawl along the bottom of the ocean. But again, an officer of the Canadian Armed Forces should not be getting involved in politics, making public speeches like this. If he has legitimate concerns about the danger of the vaccines, he's entitled to those concerns, and I think he's entitled to raise them, just not in uniform in the way that he did it. And I frankly, I think that the scandalous conduct charge should stick, regardless of what his message is. I would say that, and I say that as someone who, on this YouTube channel, has expressed sympathy for the anti-lockdown position, and who's expressed concern about the constitutional issues raised by the unprecedented laws that have been put in place. So anyway, those are just some brief thoughts. I hope it wasn't too disorganized. Again, this video is not legal advice. If you have a legal situation where you need some advice from a lawyer, you can call another lawyer or call myself. My 1-855 number and website are listed below. If you have any other topics you'd like to see me cover, please leave a comment in the comment section below. If you found this video at all helpful or informative, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing.